Hopefully, we are all unsettled after hearing the first reading from the book of Genesis, where God commands Abraham to kill his innocent son, Isaac. What is the lesson of that story? Well, there are three possibilities here, and it's none of these. So is it that the moral law does not really bind us, that the moral law is no longer that the moral law no longer binds us? Is that what the moral of the story is? It can't be that, because that's not what the Bible as a whole teaches. When God gives the law to his chosen people, Israel, he repeatedly says to them, "Be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." The moral law reflects God's character. It is, in a sense, actually describing God himself. And God is not a murderer. God is not an irrational tyrant. So that's not the lesson of the story. Nor is it, secondly, simply because God is the boss. God is the all-powerful, the omnipotent one. Of course, God is all-powerful, but that's not why we worship him as Christians. We worship him as Christians because God is good. His power is used for goodness. It's not with God, it's not might makes right. It's not that way for us either. Number three, is it that God performing kind of a laboratory experiment to see whether or not Abraham will follow in his faith and obedience what God is calling him to follow? Of course, God doesn't need to find out about anything, because God knows everything. God is never ignorant. God knows the secrets of every human heart, including what is going to happen in our future. So God is not trying to find out what Abraham is going to do. God knows already. So what's the moral or the lesson of the story of Abraham offering up his son according to God's command? Two lessons. The first lesson is the obvious one that the text itself gives us, is it spells out trust in obedience to God. Abraham, when he's tested, proves his trust in God. Abraham completely trusts in God, and therefore he obeys him completely. That's the first lesson. The second lesson seems to be that God is less moral than Abraham, because Abraham loves God and does not withhold from God what God asks. It seems to reveal that God is selfish, because he asks Abraham to give back his only son, the one he miraculously gave to Abraham when his wife was beyond the age of conceiving. It seems that God does not want Abraham to love his neighbor, and that can be perplexing to us. Even his closest neighbor, his own son, because God tells Abraham to kill Isaac, and of course killing someone is not an act of love. But in fact, it reveals just the opposite for us. It reveals the opposite. It reveals that God, unlike the pagan religions, the pagan gods of the religions, does not want human sacrifice, but animal sacrifice instead. And it also reveals that God is not so unselfish, and it also reveals that God is so unselfish that he gives us his own son. It's interesting to note that in the Jewish tradition, this story is interpreted as God not approving human sacrifices, but actually forbidding human sacrifices. That's the new lesson that God has for his chosen people, that they themselves had to learn, that the true God created man in his own image, and therefore human life is sacred. No other people knew that. Every culture approved human sacrifices, usually using it as an emergency measure, but sometimes allowing it to occur every day as an ongoing reality, as it was with the Canaanites in the time of in the Holy Land, around Abraham's time, and also the Aztecs in Mexico. Both cultures worshipped the demon gods that ruled their cultures by ritually demanding the murder of children. All other cultures in the world of Abraham's time practiced human sacrifice, but no other religion came up with the idea that God created us in his own image and likeness, and that therefore all human life is sacred. The lesson God planned to teach Abraham from the beginning came at the end of the story, not at the beginning, that he does not want human sacrifice, that man is not just another animal to be sacrificed. Well, with that first reading, we're going to come into our current cultural context in Minnesota, 2024. Here's an article from the Catholic Spirit from January 26, 2024. The headline reads, "Minnesota Catholics oppose one of the most aggressive assisted suicide bills in the country." The article says, Minnesota legislatures on January 25th moved toward passing a bill that would allow anyone without a requirement of a psychological evaluation or even the presence of a doctor when the drug is administered to get a prescription for a lethal drug in the state. The St. Paul-based Minnesota Catholic Conference, which speaks for the bishops of Minnesota, said in a recent action alert that the new bill is, quote, one of the most aggressive physician-assisted suicide bills in the country. The bill, HS 930 and SF 1813, would allow residents of any state to come to Minnesota to receive a prescription for a lethal drug. If the bill passes into law, Minnesota would become a destination for those seeking to receive the drug. Dr. John Milkey, Chief Medical Director of the St. Paul-based Presbyterian Home Services, spoke at the January 25th news conference at the Minnesota State Capitol, hosted by the Minnesota Alliance for Ethical Healthcare. He said that this bill, if passed into law, would compromise his ability to practice ethical healthcare. Milkey said that the law requires a 6-month prognosis to qualify for assisted suicide. Accurately predicting this prognosis, he said, is nearly impossible. The proposed law also states that it is optional for physicians to prescribe the life-ending medication, a fact that is often touted by advocates of the bill. But Milkey said that he would still be required to refer the patient to a doctor who would be able to perform the life-ending medication. He said this would compromise his conscience. Moreover, the proposed law would bar doctors from listing physician-assisted suicide as the cause of death. In effect, Milkey said, doctors would routinely be untruthful. The law proposed would require doctors to be dishonest on the patient's death certificate, he explained. This corrupts the physician's ethics and truthfulness, Milkey stated. The proposed bill would also not require family of people who could elect to receive the lethal drug to be notified, nor would it provide any safeguards for disabled people who may be coerced into accepting the medication. The Minnesota Catholic Conference stated that the new law violates the teaching of the Catholic Church. Quote, as Catholics, we are called to uphold human dignity, MCC wrote in an action alert. Quote, legalizing assisted suicide works against this principle because death is hastened when it is thought that a person's life is no longer meaningful or has a purpose. Homebound ministers, doctors and nurses and medical professionals and caregivers, social workers and nursing care teams, I think we need to thank you that you provide the service that people who are ill need, that you provide service for those who are at the end of life that they need, rather than having some kind of pill to kill them. In 2019, Pope Francis spoke out against physician-assisted suicide. He said, a man or a woman should be accompanied with conscience, intelligence, and a heart, especially when the most serious situations arrive. We can and must reject the temptation also induced by legislative changes to use medicine to support the possible willingness of a patient to die, providing assistance for suicide or directly causing death by euthanasia. What people need is care. What we need is love. What we need is compassion. What we need is someone to visit us when we're ill, someone to hold our hand when we are dying, and someone to come to bring us communion for those of us who are Catholics when we're ill or maybe getting to the end of our life. And that's where I certainly want to thank our homebound ministers for the love that they support. We need to create a culture that cares for people in their frailty, in their illness, in their disability. This is a very important time in the history of our state, because if we pass this bill, then it becomes an option. And if we pass this bill, then I need to be asking myself, is my life worthy? Or am I going to be a burden because I have this illness? Is your life worthy? Or are you a burden to society? Then interiorly, we will be asking these questions of ourselves because society says there is a possibility that you could choose. And maybe you should choose it because we put it in there in the bill. We put it into law. It's the law that you can take your life. If we take this step, we're going to be sliding down a slippery slope, and it really is a slippery slope. Not to just being free to choose if we want to end our life, which is immoral, but to feel obligated to end our life because I think I might be a burden to society. We are a burden to Jesus. We are a big burden to Jesus. And so we ought to be willing to be burdened by others. And so once again, thank you to all those who take care of your elderly parents, your grandparents, those in the medical field, who are doing what we need to do to love the sick, the ill, the dying, the disabled, those who need our help, because you know who that is? It's every one of us. We all need help. We all need help. Whether we're 18 and we have all our faculties and we have all these bulging muscles, whether we are 50 and our mind is working clearly and we're at the top of our game in our career, whatever age we are, we all need help. It's a lie that some lives are not worth living. It's a lie. And we ought not to live our lives according to lies. And so really pray and look online, the Minnesota Catholic Conference, or go to the Archdiocese and speak up against this, because this is a slippery slope. We are dignified. That's why God did not want Abraham to kill Isaac, because we are made in the image and the likeness of God, and the only person that can take life is God. The only person who can take life is God. And if we take life in this way, as we have at the beginning of life with abortion, God help us. God help us. God is the author of life. God is the one who says, choose life and love your brother and sister, whatever their condition may be. That's God's way. Let's live God's way. And pray and reach out to your legislatures to tell them what you think. And you don't even have to bring up religion, because it's just wrong to take the life of another person or allow another person to take their own life by making a law that says it's okay to do that.